Welcome guests to Humanity 2.0's YouTube channel. On today's show, we're going to be talking about death or escaping death. And we're focusing our conversation by looking at two industries, the emerging digital afterlife or archiving industry and the growing life extension industry. And I'm delighted to have on the show four guests with very interesting backgrounds. Professor Steve Fuller, Sister Mary Christa Nutt, Dr. Anders Sandberg, and Professor James Madden. Thank you all for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So this issue of longing to live on after death obviously isn't new. I mean, I'm reminded of Hercules from the Iliad and his desire for his team to live on for eternity. So I want to ask, how is today's desire to live on after death different from the ancient Greeks? So Professor Steve, why don't you get the ball rolling here?
Okay. Well, first of all, I think a sort of short way of describing what the Greeks were up to in terms of their conception of afterlife was that the memory of your deeds would actually live on in the memories of people living in the future. So from our standpoint, they were primarily interested in fame and reputation. So, for example, if you talk about Hercules, then, one might, because people remember Hercules' deeds in the future, they will try to act in a Herculean way. He'll be a kind of inspiration, right? And so in that sense, the spirit would live on in these other people. But what there wasn't was any kind of sense of their spirits literally living on in an afterlife, right? The spirit was not autonomous in that sense. There was no kind of conception of that. And this is quite different from the kind of thing that we're seeing today with the digital afterlife and a lot of those kinds of ideas that are on the table now.
Sister Mary, do you want to jump in?
Sure, I would jump in with just some questions in regard to that interpretation of the Greeks. And the first thing that I would ask is just point out one thing, which is in a certain way, the Greeks did succeed because we're still talking about them.
Right.
So something about their aspiration actually has been unfolded and succeeded. The second thing is that just an interesting thing is human beings tend to seek to live on in the way that they believe is possible to them. And that's the only avenue they understood as a possibility. But I would interject that the aspiration is the same, and they're just looking for the door to walk through that leaves the possibility open. In other words, it seems to us today that the possibility to live on, even in individual consciousness, as you're putting it, is an open door through technology. And there's various other ways that people look to have this aspiration fulfilled. In other words, you have Christianity, the promise of everlasting life.
Of course.
You have fame as one avenue. You have technology as another avenue, and many others. So you see some kind of a similar aspiration in all times.
Yeah.
Indeed, if you go back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest epic, at least the second half of it is all about King Gilgamesh's search for immortality in the form of a physical herb that would have given him immortality. But unfortunately, it was stolen by a snake, which is, of course, why all snakes are immortal these days. But then he has to settle for just being immortal in thoughts and deeds. And indeed, the epic kind of did a good job on that.
So let me ask you, so today, are people motivated by the same desire? Is it really about ensuring that they live on after death so that their deeds live on or in the memories of other people? Or are they actually like longing for something else?
Well, do you want me to give a kind of answer to this?
Go for it.
Okay. I'm not going to talk at this point about the idea of living forever in your own biological body, which is, of course, one aspiration, a kind of a familiar transhumanist aspiration. Instead, I'm going to talk about the sort of more radical, exotic possibility, which is that there's a digital afterlife. Okay, and the idea here being, the way it's been sort of classically put forward in transhumanist literature and also in science fiction in the 20th century was in terms of somehow mind uploading. You could upload consciousness into a machine. So once your biological body is dead, right, nevertheless, the vital spiritual conscious aspect can, in a sense, get resurrected in this more durable, in principle, perhaps permanent kind of silicon form. and where it could even be enhanced. Okay. And in a way, the enhancement part of that story is kind of the interesting part, as far as I think this kind of discussion is concerned, because what people are thinking about here, I think, is the idea that their spirit, in a way, can live on not merely in the sense of surviving in some kind of, you know, like an insect in amber, right? It's not really like that. It's rather, it could actually continue to develop. Okay, and so when people talk about this kind of digital afterlife stuff or mind uploading more generally, they're very often talking about it in a sense that so let's assume that your consciousness, however you define it, is actually uploaded. Well, it develops. It will interact with other, you know, things that have been uploaded, with other forms of information, and it will continue to evolve long, you know, in perpetuity, perhaps. And then there's some very interesting questions that can start to be asked about whether you can retain your individuality under those circumstances, right? That in some sense, you know, as these uploaded minds are mixing with each other and interacting with each other, whether you start to get into something closer to a sort of hive mind or a kind of Borg-like state, you know, from Star Trek, right, where individual's mind plugs into a larger mind and becomes part of that in some sense. It seems to me that all of those kinds of options, a lot of them, by the way, do have resonance within the history of Christianity and Islam, especially in a kind of Neoplatonic tradition. It seems to me, you know, but this is kind of the sort of story we're talking about here, where there's a sense in which the mind doesn't just survive in the way, you know, but it actually continues to develop in some way.
Right.
And that's what makes it, to me, very interesting.
You know, this reminds me of in that popular TV show WestWorld, right? Where people's consciousness are actually being kind of like mapped, and then they're being uploaded to this big data center. And at one point in the show, someone who had actually died is actually kind of the caretaker of this digital archive, and that character, real living characters in the show, are interacting with this person who's gone, but their consciousness in some ways is still around and developing and aware. So anyways, it seems like in popular culture, we're exploring these themes.
Oh, yes, for sure.
But the big question is that the person who they're talking to in that digital space, is that the same person, or is that just some kind of weird copy?
I'd like to. So I think that is the standard problem when dealing with the uploading scenario. I wrote a roadmap on the technology involved in the requirements we would need to have achieved to achieve it. But then, of course, there is a laundry list of philosophical assumptions and personal identity. People have so divergent views that typically it's like flypaper. The conversation gets stuck on either that or whether there is consciousness. And then you can't actually move on very far because we all disagree with each other on that. And I think the honest answer is we don't know yet.
Right. Professor James.
I wonder if I could contribute to the flypaper on that a little. Leaving aside just the fascinating metaphysical issue of whether machines can be conscious. I just want to talk for a moment about what it is for a human to be conscious. I mean, we know that human consciousness, even its higher rational functions, came online as part of the development of an organism, of an animal, dealing with a physical environment, pushing back against our attempts to cope with it. And I think this is underexplored in these topics, that as soon as you've gone to the point that we're uploading consciousness into machinery that is completely separated from that environment of physical involvement, of animal involvement, I think it's a very important question whether or not that's me, or because it's not a human organism and what I am is a human organism. I think we're very quick to identify ourselves with our consciousness and leave our bodies behind, right? Well, I'll let you can elaborate more if you want.
Can I?
Yes. Okay.
Sorry.
All right, go for it.
I was gonna interject one thing. I cut out a little bit, so I didn't hear everything. But right along those same lines, I just like to bring up the situation of a paraplegic, because a paraplegic is a person who lives on perfectly healthily in the mind often, but the body is in a sense no longer accessible to them. And they find a tremendous situation of frustration when they can't express their lives, their minds, through the use of their limbs and their body. I mean, a frustration, which I don't think we can imagine. And so I think you have to look at the situation of the human person who is, in a sense, the closest thing we have an example of detached from the body, what that experience is like. It's more like a torture than a way of life.
Well, let me ask you this question then. Does it really matter, this issue of defining it? Does it really matter? Do we have to come up with a universal rule or definition as to what constitutes life after death, of whether or not, whatever that digital avatar is, whether it's truly human or not? I mean, is it something that we should just leave to the individuals to decide? And that's really it? Or do we actually civilization have to actually say, no, animals with consciousness are human beings. Whatever that is something else.
Yeah. Frankly, I just don't care if a digital avatar of me would survive on indefinitely, because I see myself as this ape sitting in this chair, right? And when that ape is gone, I see myself, I will be gone. So I think we do have to answer those kinds of questions to see whether or not, this is a technology that should be at all interesting to us.
But I think we have.
Go ahead. Go ahead, sister.
I was gonna say, I think we have to ask one other question that we haven't completely ascertained: is the human mind entirely a conglomerate of neurons, synapses, cells, atoms, and material realities, even electronic impulses? What if the human soul, and I'm playing devil's advocate here, is immaterial and it won't bind to technology? Then in a way, when this whole industry is really pulling people's chain, you could say, because the human soul won't bind outside of a biological living body. And you could say bind.
Great analogy.
Can I say something in response to that?
To pull back to the WestWorld analogy, right? This is actually played out in WestWorld itself, where the guy Delos, which is the company, which is kind of the proto-villain in the show, he dies, and they download his conscience, and what they're trying to do is put his consciousness into a new body, and it keeps failing, and so they keep trying for decades to do this. And so again, I think that's an important question, and I think media is already starting to reflect on it. So the question does matter. Professor Steve.
Yeah. First of all, I do think one would have to get very clear about what counts as success and failure in these kinds of transfers of mind to other media. Okay, so I think in a sense we would need to get clear on that to know whether in fact because no one would expect, for example, I don't think at least. It seems to me that most philosophers would say if there is continuity of personal identity from one medium to another, from one body to another, whether it be a biological or silicon or whatever, it doesn't necessarily need to preserve every single memory or moment in the original. Okay, so there's an issue about what sort of fidelity are we talking about here as we make the transfer. In a way, this is kind of, in a more technological vein, this is kind of what the issue of digitalization is about, right? That when you digitize something, you're not necessarily reproducing exactly what you're taking from the original.
So you're assuming up front you identify yourself with your consciousness.
Yes, exactly. But what is it that you're identifying yourself with, right? You might be identifying yourself with a lot less than you think you are. Right. In other words, your personal identity may not require every single memory to survive, for example. Yeah. Right. And that's a really important point.
I'm calling the question whether or not we ought to identify ourselves with consciousness.
Okay. In response to your earlier point, look, it's really only in the 18th century that you get some kind of consensus that human beings are apes. Okay. In other words, Homo sapiens, this idea that to be a human, you have to be an ape first. Right, you only really get that on the table in some kind of clear sense in the 18th century with Linnaeus and the coinage of Homo sapiens. But before that time, there's a very open question. I mean, because just because you say human beings have to be animals and have to be material, and of course you can find all that in Thomas Aquinas and all the rest of them, it doesn't follow necessarily they're committing us to the idea that we have to be apes. It just means that there's an animal nature.
Okay, now can I interrupt again?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Okay, one thing I want to interrupt with is just something simple to consult our experience. Imagine a life without human touch, where you cannot experience being embraced, held. In other words, there's a strong component of our bodies that makes the quality of our life. Imagine a human being with no human touch. Imagine your consciousness not united to a body, which could be loved, hugged, touched, kissed, all those things. You imagine, so people who experience this, or the loss of memory, let's say people who are who have a concussion and experience severe loss of memory, they experience these things in this life, their consciousness, as tortures. So you have to say, what does this say about the unity between the human body and the soul?
Yeah, and you know what? This is actually, and I'm the guy with the endless pop cultural references, but in the film Ex Machina, for those of you who saw
Sure.
it,
Yeah. Yes.
conversation transpires, right? Where essentially what he says is, if there weren't these prime drives that are built into this animal form, like the desire to reproduce, what reason would one rock have to talk to another rock, right? And so I think that's interesting. You take away the body, and would consciousness even develop? And Anders, I want to get you in here for this part.
Yeah, so when I wrote the roadmap on brain emulation, I had a chapter about making a body model, because it's pretty obvious that just having a neural network floating in cyberspace, that will not work. Even when we see, even when we look, we move our eyes around. It's not like it's a picture, a bitmap that is just projected straight into our brain. It's an active process. Similarly, quite a lot of our thinking and speaking is through our gestures, not only to others, but to ourselves. So I concluded we need an adequate body model. That might not necessarily be an accurate, just like digitalization might not keep everything. It's important to keep the right things. And I completely agree with Sister Mary that, yes, without touch, you would go mad very quickly. What my nightmare scenario is to wake up, find myself in Second Life or something like that. I would go mad very quickly. The problem is, of course, what is adequate? That might depend very much on people's mindsets. So, for example, I have a slightly peculiar view of personal identity. I regard myself as the equivalence class of all sufficiently Anders-like processes. Even fellow philosophers think this is my bad. So I might be okay with a personal identity that, for example, my downstairs neighbor says, no, that's not me. I have to be a physical, biological body out in the actual world. We might actually see that different people get quite different views on what success would entail. And it's interesting because it's both success internally. Would I be happy, or the future entity be happy with the situation? And the social identity. Would my family agree that, yeah, Anders is in the computer now, oh dear? Or would they say, yeah, there is a bad copy of Anders there?
Now, let me ask one other question in terms of something a little more universal than simply each person's preference for how they're touched, how often they're touched, whether or not they need human biological contact. We know, for example, that human babies who are completely neglected from touch simply die. Mm-hmm. So you have to say, what if there's a more universal component? And I come back to my earlier question. What if the soul is not uploadable technologically? What if there's an immaterial component and not only material components? And second of all, what if there's a universality in the need for certain kinds of biological responses in all people, whether or not we are able to accept that or not?
Well, I mean, listen, let me ask. Part of this is just experimentation, right? I mean, these new companies that are basically being created that are promising to, like, a digital afterlife in one form or the other. The fact is, we don't really know. So these companies are obviously going to endeavor to prove the point. My question is it okay for them to be doing that, or is it something that society should discourage? So let me ask that open question.
Can I make a point about that right off?
Go for it.
Yeah, so leaving aside whether this can be done, let's suppose it can be done. Let's suppose we could come up with an acceptable theory of personal identity, and we could say it's possibly uploadable on the machine. My biggest worry about whether it should be done, right, whether is there's a temporal structure to human life that we've lived with, for our entire history, that involves finitude, that involves death, right? And I really wonder what happens if you take that endpoint out. Like, what comes of ambition, right? To what degree, would I have gotten up and worked out this morning if I had infinite time to lose that 10 pounds, right? Without that structuring of an endpoint, what does it look like to actually strive? And another worry I have is it seems that much of what we just identify with, whether it's a religious or a secular outlook, with spiritual maturity is accepting the fact that the universe will go on very well without Jim Madden, right? And that ultimately the universe is not about Jim Madden because I'm going to occupy a tiny slice of the time of that thing. I wonder what do we look like if we have natural immortality, where there is no endpoint, there's no sense in which we think the universe won't go on without us, right? I think we lose the structure that is human ambition, provides human ambition. I think, and I think we lose this possibility of what we've identified as actual spiritual maturity throughout human history.
Well, can I jump in on that? It seems to me he's raising a very good point in the sense that, it may have only been 250 years or so that humans have been identified with apes, but when humans are identified as animals, it's often the issue of mortality that is the thing that's brought in. This gets tied in with a lot of stuff having to do with the life cycle and the need for reproduction and all this other stuff that's also been part of the moral focus of what makes a human being. Because I think in a sense, regardless of how broadly a notion of human that you want, I think it's fair to say that in just about every culture, regardless of the religious tradition, there has been a focus on mortality and the way in which the being unto death actually forces you to come up with priorities to give, to sort out what's important, not important, and all the rest of it. And it is true, and I think this is a kind of ethical problem that transhumanists face generally, is if you remove mortality from the table, right? And you say, I have this kind of indefinite life, whether it be in my biological body of birth or whether it be digitally uploaded, then this whole idea of where does the purpose in life come from starts to get very vague and very unclear under those circumstances. And it seems to me it's that aspect of the nature of humanity, which is so closely tied to mortality, that I think is kind of the thing that starts throwing the human up in the air as a concept.
Yeah. It would also bring up, excuse me.
Oh, go ahead, sister.
It would also bring up a question as you're talking. It's bringing to my mind, how would that affect solidarity or humanitarian efforts among men? In other words, if we know that people starving in Africa can simply be uploaded, and we won't have to feed them anymore, so we don't have to worry about disease or food. We simply, we could even exterminate them quicker, upload them and let them live a digital afterlife. So why would we then extend to other human beings kindness, hospitals, hospice care? Why don't we just quickly kill an infant as soon as it's born and upload its, especially if the memory is not significant, upload its
you've got a point, actually. You've got a point, sister. You got a point.
I want to get Anderson here.
But isn't this exactly the problem religions have? After all, if you believe in a religious afterlife, why help the sick? Let them go to God. Why help
Well,
the
actually,
sick?
I have to interject there.
God.
Not all religions say that. Not all religions say that.
You have deeply misunderstood religious.
It's actually quite divided.
Actually,
And if you have, the reason religious people actually don't think that it's a good thing to let the sick die is the suffering, and of course that you want them to continue and grow even in the afterlife. If you think that is a good thing to exist even in an uploaded form, you probably don't want to have that imposed on people and put them there without their own volition.
And so, Anders, are you talking about this is really about a question of values?
I think that it's a profound question of values. The shape of life, I think, is important indeed for how people think about life. Somebody once said, life is like a book. It should have a beginning, middle, and an end. And she was using that to criticize life extension cryonics. But you could imagine that maybe some people are pamphlets and maybe some people are 7-volume fantasy novels. It's not clear what kind of book we should aim at becoming. And different people might very well have very different shapes of life. The idea that there is one shape that is the one human one we should all accept, I think even religions clearly have very different views on what makes sense here.
All right, Mary.
I was just going to say, I have to interject briefly about your understanding of religion. And it's definitely not a forum to critique various religions or the time. But I have to say only that you have deeply misrepresented the way that understanding humanitarian efforts and religion actually functions within its own. If you want to take it within its own context, you have deeply misrepresented it.
Well, Sister Mary,
My point was not to criticize religion. It was to point out that the idea that kill them all and upload them is about as crazy as saying let them die and let God sort them out. It's the same kind of weird misrepresentation.
And if I may, I think both of those positions that Anders is worried about are what happens when you unhinge human nature from embodiment. That when we don't see embodiment as integral to what we are.
Right. I mean, I think it also brings up an issue of values, right? I mean, if we have these, if only the technologists are having these conversations and they're not talking to the philosophers or the ethicists, we could see basically this happening, right? But luckily, we're having this conversation right now, and so because we are concerned about the topic, I have to think that that's an outcome we're likely not going to see. But that being said, the one question I want to put to you all, and then we'll transition on, is this industry is moving forward. And I think what we're talking about is transferring one's consciousness, from this state into an online is a very advanced version of this conversation. I think what we're hearing a lot more about is people's versions of their lives, which are played out through social media and stuff like that, live on in some ways, or are archived, and somehow those records, the fact that they're never destroyed, is some kind of continuity. So let's just briefly touch on that issue before moving on to life extension.
Do you want me to start with that?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, because I have a PhD student who's actually working on this digital afterlife industry, and let me draw a distinction in how this industry works. There are, and I think Matthew referred to the distinction in one of his emails, the distinction between the digital creators and the digital inheritors. Okay, the digital creators are basically the people who archive or self-archive, right, all of the stuff on social media, et cetera, and perhaps bring in a lot of the legacy media and digitize that, right? And there are companies that help these digital creators do that, right? And they make money from doing that. Now, the digital inheritors are the people who, are the ones who live afterwards, right? After the person has deceased, who has provided all of this material. And they're the ones who will be experiencing it in various ways. Now, the interesting question that arises from this digital afterlife industry is that the providers, that is to say, the people who make money from doing this, are actually developing ways in which your digital archives can be enhanced by having sophisticated algorithms that will actually recombine, let's say, your vocal patterns, recombine videos and whatever, and come up with new versions of yourself in perpetuity, right? So in other words, in this respect, you could live on in a digital afterlife that is always different, right? It's always changing, and it can mix with other things as well, so it has this kind of autonomous identity. And the interesting thing that my student has found out is that the digital inheritors, that is the people on the receiving end of it, especially the loved ones, hate this idea.
Yeah.
Right? They want, the person they want to remember is the one who had been alive before, not this kind of enhanced, God knows what's going to happen to them, right? Once they've been circulating through the internet a little while, right? And so they find it very alienating, actually, to have a kind of enhanced version of their loved one, circulating and interacting with them as if it were a kind of living person. And
okay.
Go ahead. Okay.
So let's put this issue in the context of rights, because I think this is the quickest way to get to the point. All right, so I have a right to ensure that my digital legacy lives on. I think very few people would disagree with this. But do people on the other end have a right to not be engaging with your digital avatar once you're dead? And if that is a right that makes sense to us, how would you ever go about safeguarding or honoring those rights?
Well, this is very tricky. This is, in fact, a kind of work in progress at the moment, because there really aren't laws governing how this we're sort of in the Wild West stage of this kind of industry. Okay, right. But my guess is it is going to get regulated at some point along the lines that you're raising, because people do get very disturbed by having these autonomous digital avatars, who used to be their father and mother, right? All of a sudden taking on new personalities as a result of circulating through the internet. They do find this very disturbing.
And of course, it raises another question, which would be pretending imagining that it is possible to upload some sort of a personality, it would require the upkeep of others, also financially. And how can you obligate people to financially, unless not everybody or nobody can ensure that they can pay for the rest of their existence, be it eternal or whatever, for the upkeeping of this digital personality.
We need a digital welfare state.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I'm making
Go ahead,
sorry.
Jack.
So one interesting thing is the obligations we both have to our descendants and inheritors, and the obligation we have to the people who have died. So I'm writing a book right now. If I were to keel over right this moment, presumably I would be very keen on having that book completed by my colleagues. Although it's 800 pages of really messy documents, my wish would be to impose a bit of a load on them. And maybe it's fair, maybe not. In fact, there should be a choice done there. I can't force them to finish my book, but maybe they do have some obligation to finish it for me. And the same thing is, of course, what about my digital persona? Who has an obligation to run it? And maybe there is an obligation to remember our ancestors in the way they wanted, kind of temporal golden rule. But it's not unlimited. If people want to have polished golden pyramids, that's kind of rather extreme. So we might actually say there is a limit here. Testaments have a limited applicability.
Professor James, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I find this fascinating. Going back to the very beginning of what Steve brought up with this is, so you're going to start out with the basic information that I leave behind in my various social media accounts, et cetera, et cetera. And there's this assumption that's somehow an authentic reflection of who I am. But I mean, really what that is for the vast majority of us is a carefully self-selected presentation of our most flattering things, right?
Well, hopefully. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah,
Some people are our own worst enemies on this.
I think one of the problems with social media in general is it's this place where I can make this self-presentation that's almost unchecked, right? And everybody's happy and successful and all that on social media because I don't put up my failings on social media. And so if I never step out of social media back into the real world where I have to talk to my wife and she tells me that I'm full of BS, right? Is that really me anymore, or just this very carefully selected act I'm putting on for the rest of the world? Now, of course, I think in the model you see, Steve, that you're going to be interacting with other things on the internet and you'll get corrected that way. But no, the origin point of it won't be me, but it will be my social media persona, which is something, it's a role we play in this sort of strange postmodern play, but it's not really us.
And
I'd like to add to that.
That's like play out, just one second, sister, throughout for decades now, right? You guys remember when the original Superman, how he interacts with his father, which is some kind of like digital avatar in which he can ask questions and such. Now, I don't think Superman has any under conception that that's actually his father. But I know he appreciates the fact that he can ask the questions he never got a chance to, ask him when he was alive. So I think there's some legitimacy, to this issue. I'm thinking about if I'm a soldier and I get sent overseas and my child's just a kid, it's just a child, and he's not able to ask me the big questions in life, and I get killed on the battlefield. As a soldier, I may like the idea of leaving something of myself behind that he can interact with to some extent, and I think that that's a legitimate, thing to desire. Now, at the same time, we're living in the era of deepfakes, right? So I'm a little bit concerned as well about someone taking my avatar and deepfaking me, right? And my legacy gets trashed by some hacker. So I think there is.
There you go.
I think this brings us back to the point again that regardless of how we would like to define a human being, it brings us back to some truths we can't deny about the human being, which is that a digital self-presentation like we're looking at over the internet, the digital self-presentation, or what I present or don't present to other people, brings us back to the fact that people don't feel known when they're only presenting certain aspects of themselves, nor are they more fully known. And if you can grasp what I'm trying to say here, if I'm making my point, there's something about the full embodiment of the human person in all aspects of their lives, which makes them both feel known and be known. And we also know that the primary relationships through digital media are not bringing a greater quotient of happiness right now. Suicide rates are rising. So we have to say, what does that tell us about the human person? We come back to that same question of the full embodiment of the human person, bringing full satisfaction, happiness on the part of those known and being known.
I'm going to give Sister the last word on this topic because we're going to pivot because I think that was brilliant. Well said.
Sister.
I want to pivot now just briefly to the issue of life extension. All right. So I'm not talking about transferring your consciousness into some digital. I'm talking about the actual biological self living on indefinitely. And this has been explored in popular media for a long time. But it's becoming a little bit more interesting now. There's a famous person, I think transhumanists we've heard about, Ray Kurzweil, and he signed up for basically a cryogenics, or is I getting it right? For Anders, is it
cryopreservation? I'm signed up too.
Okay, there we go. So let's talk a little bit about that. So because I think they're and in the context of the Earth and limited resources and stuff like that, and the fact it's a very expensive process, I presume that it is, to freeze yourself in hopes of being resurrected. Let's talk a little bit about why this might be a very positive thing. People with let's say chronic disease. And why some people may be concerned with the fact that maybe only a certain cohort of people will be living on indefinitely and others will never just have access to those technologies. So Anders, you want to get started on that one?
Sure. So the idea with cryonics is basically take somebody who present medicine cannot save, cryopreserve them in the hope that future medicine will be able to save them from both what was killing them and, of course, the damage you would get from cryopreservation. It is somewhat costly, but compared to the cost of an intensive care unit and treatment at the end of life, actually, it's surprisingly cost effective because you're not trying to prolong things too much. So the real question is, of course, do we want people in the future to include some of the current people, or do we say, oh, we should be leaving those spaces for some other random people?
Well, let me ask you, Anders, about this. So do you think people's primary motivation, is it about like, oh my gosh, I got into a car accident and one of my organs was hurt and we can't fix me, so freeze me. And then, maybe in 10 years time, we can get me a new heart. Or is it really about, I don't want to die. And I'm hoping that if they freeze me near the end of my life, that they'll figure out this whole living on forever thing and I'll be resurrected. What do you think? I don't know anyone who signed up for this program aside from yourself. What do you think the prime incentives for people in this program are?
I think it's not so much that first acute thing, oh, I'm losing an organ, but it's rather people do want to live on, and you do get the positive and negative views. One is the fear of death. Yeah, I don't want to go into the great unknown. And the other one, which I'm much more in favor of, is I love life. I want to be around. I want to explore things and see things. And then there is a chance of maybe doing more of that. Now, I don't think you get a particularly good life if you try to avoid death, because obviously cryonics is risky. And even if that works, you can still get run over by a truck or have bad luck in some other way. So that running away from death will not work long term. But generally, cryonicists, they tend to be optimistic because we have to be optimistic both about that medicine in the future is going to be pretty good and that they are going to be signed up properly. And of course, that future generation want to have them. Because that's another interesting ethical issue. There is a choice in future generation whether to actually talk people up or not.
Now, can I ask another question here? What if while you're frozen, what is happening to you while you're frozen? In other words, what is it like to be frozen indefinitely? We don't know.
Right.
What is happening to you while you're frozen?
There is actually some people who have been frozen, at least according to some philosophical accounts, and that's actually embryos. The embryo freezing is happening, so there is quite a lot of people who have been frozen if you regard them as people when they're embryos. But in practice, yes, the normal materialist view would be, well, the brain can't fire, they can't do anything, so you can't have any experience. Of course, it might turn out when we throw out the first few people that they actually had experience, which would be amazingly interesting philosophically and religiously, but also kind of disturbing.
Can I ask you a question, Anders, about what you were saying earlier about people who are into cryonics wanting to live longer because they love life and they're not afraid of death and all of this. But is it not true that if you're really going to be able to take cryonics seriously, there has, the moment you die, there has to be someone around, some medical people or something around to be able to get your organs into the deep freeze before they start deteriorating. So doesn't that then constrain the actual places you can go to in the world? I mean, doesn't that put a kind of constraint on your life if that's kind of in the back of your mind?
Well, I got this little tag instructing hospital people to call the cryonics company if I'm dying, and then hopefully a suspension team can show up. But I don't have great hopes on this side of Atlantic of this actually working. So that if I were really, really concerned about having the best chances of getting a cryonic suspension, I should probably hang around close to a cryonics company.
Well,
which would really constrain.
But
I have a friend, he was a mountaineer, and he said, I believe in cryonics, but I'm likely to splatter, so there's no point for me to sign up. I think it depends on, are you willing to take some risk for your life,
right,
some future, or are you going to say, oh, I can only eat the really healthy food and 5,000 supplements and live next door to the cryo company? There are some people who think like that, and I don't envy them at all. I think we should help them enjoy their lives a bit more.
You should talk to Ray Kurzweil then. He's one of those people. Professional hypochondriac.
Can I point out a tremendous contradiction in some of the things we're saying here between this conversation and the last one, which again points to a certain level of non-advertence to what a human being is? We're talking about the prolongation of life so that we can enjoy it, climb mountains, see beautiful things, and not have to be constantly tethered to the cryonics place. And then we just said before that we would upload a digital life and we wouldn't need the embodied experiences of climbing mountains and seeing beautiful things and having people we know around us. So we're actually contradicting ourselves greatly here, and we're sort of admitting something about human beings that we didn't admit in the first conversation.
Right.
I think a little bit here. I think actually the uploaded minds might very well be actually climbing actual mountains too. Partly because they could be virtual mountains, but also pretty likely actually robot or android bodies. But do you agree that there is something important going on here? The point of cryonics is that you want to live a life. I think the point of uploading is that at least for some of us with suitably weird views, we believe that is a good life. The problem with these kind of things based on social media is that's definitely not a continuation of a life. That's something we impose on others. But the core question is, of course, why would you want life extension? And I agree with you. That is because we want more of a life that we think is a reasonable life.
So I see the cryonics option, once again fits better with my view about personal identity, because it would be this body that returns. But once again, I worry just in general about the human disposition to hedge against death to that extent, right? To extend biological life indefinitely. I wonder if we do lose that temporal structure that death provides. That is paradoxically the very source of meaning in life, right? That the fact that we are finite is what we are.
Professor James, this is a good point to kind of pivot. So we've looked at the issue of cryonics, right? Now let's talk about some companies like Calico, which is an Alphabet subsidiary, are looking for ways to kind of, through all kinds of different intervention points, extend human life, right? So let's say that we're able to kind of tweak the genome and we're able to kind of live on for hundreds of years. Yeah. I want to talk about that a little bit because I think it has a lot of issues surrounding it. I mean, some people would say we're already overpopulated as a planet, we're straining the Earth's resources, and now we're talking about people living hundreds of years. The planet could literally collapse. Others would say, no, it's not, because you'd have to be super rich to afford these kind of interventions. And so, it's only gonna be a very small percentage that lives on forever, but it'll likely be the super rich, and the poor will likely just live short lifespans. And you even see this kind of play out in the TV show The Expanse, where the Earthers and the people on Mars, which are from a little bit more advanced civilizations, have longer lifespans, and people that are in the asteroid belt mining all the resources to supply Earth and Mars have very short lifespans. So let's talk a little bit about this issue of extending life through manipulating the genome and such.
Can I?
Well,
you want me? Okay, I'll go first. Well, first of all, I mean, one option that you haven't mentioned with regard to, so let's say we can extend life indefinitely, is the way you might solve the population problem is by people not having children anymore, because people will be able to do in their lifetime all the stuff that in the past, right, because they've had limited lives, they would sort of invest in their children as hopes that they might be able to carry out. I mean, and I think this in a way gets to my mind at least, what's ethically problematic about this is that living forever, if you can pull it off, no matter how many people can pull it off, so we can talk about the numbers here, but let's say it's generally available, I do think it kind of encourages a certain kind of maybe self-sufficiency, selfishness that sort of goes against a lot of the sort of social aspects of the human condition. And I think that, to me, that's kind of the main problem I would have about that. Just, right off the bat is a kind of, so even assuming that lots of people could have it.
Right. Professor James, you want to jump in there? You sound like you.
Well, I agree wholeheartly. It's one of the things I worry about in all of these is that when I become immortal, it just seems I have less of a stock in other people. Right? When I'm not finite, if I become infinite, it's easy for me to fall under the delusion that that I'm the center of the universe. Whereas if I know the universe is going to get along very well without me, just as it got along very well before I arrived, I'm constantly reminded by the specter of death. It seems that there's a kind of human solidarity, a kind of charity I need to be open to, because I need to see, I'm going to be led to see that what is valuable is going to be something that I leave for others, not what I get.
Right. It also makes, I agree with you very much, but it also leads me to bring up another point, is that all the solutions that we're talking about are still human beings grasping for an autonomy or an independence, which we won't actually attain. In other words, if you're frozen, you're still depending on those who are keeping you frozen and waking you back up and developing science, and you're still dependent in the same way if you are digitally uploaded in some way. And in the end, this grasp to extend human life and gain autonomy over death is not actually going to give us the independence or the immortality really that we're seeking. So you have to say we're going to face the same kind of dependence at the end of it.
Well, one of the interesting problems is that people always tend to express life extension as a search for immortality, which it probably can't do because we're finite beings in a random universe. Sooner or later, our luck runs out, no matter what we do, no matter how many backup copies we have stashed away on remote planet. Indeed, life extension, we should probably more talk about health extension. We want more of a healthy lifespan. I wonder how much independence you actually get, because older people, they typically tend to recognize actually that they are dependent for their healthcare on other people. They have actually seen through a long life that indeed that there is a fair bit they depend on. Also, I would like to point out, I do believe that if we actually got life extension that worked well, governments would be so motivated to spread it to everybody because it saves on healthcare costs like crazy. From a purely economic perspective, they would love to see human capital retained and would love to see people having fewer age-related diseases. So they would probably subsidize the whole thing.
I think that's correct. That's correct.
Except what kind of costs are required for the technology that can theoretically support an uploaded personality? What kind of costs are associated with cryogenics, unfreezing? So there's going to be a whole new cost load associated with the extension. But I'd like to point out
the good news for the good news for cryonics is, of course, that being suspended is super cheap because you only need liquid nitrogen. So that is not a problem. It's expensive to freeze people from the start and get them out, presumably. The uploads, that depends on the data center. And the life extension, we're already seeing it. We're already life extended because we doubled the lifespan over our century. In many ways, if we want to look at the utopian, dystopian life extension, we're already living in it in the Western world, I think.
Right. Well, let me ask one question here, and maybe we'll sum up this this talk. Does it really come down to intentionality, the reason why people want to live on forever? Because, there's this great saying, if you have something to do, you tend to stick around to do it, right? And I wonder, I think for a lot of people as they age, that becomes one of the, having that reason to continue to live is what keeps them living longer, right? When that reason is gone, they tend to drift off. And so let me ask you, so how important is this intentionality, that this desire? How does it factor into this?
I think it's enormously important. My grandfather, when he was 80, he had done everything he wanted and needed to do in his life, and he kind of just gently left. My grandmother, at 109 years old, she finally died, and that was kind of upsetting her social schedule of having coffee with the little old ladies of her time. So in many ways, both were good lives because they ended where they should have ended according to the intentions. And I do think we need to consider what are good intentions, what are sane intentions and healthy intentions, and can we learn that over lifespan? That's not going to be an easy thing, but I think it's going to be crucial for getting life intention and meaning.
May I ask you this question? If the universe is random and our existence is luck, why prolong our lives? And what would determine what's a healthy or a good existence and what's not?
Wow, that's a bomb question, Mary. A bomb of a question.
I love the question.
I might go on for some time.
I would like to say I like to play the game as long as I can. I might not get high score or something like that.
But why
but
do
I
you
find
want
it a
to
very
play?
fun game to play.
Why? It's pleasurable. You said it's fun. So you like to play the game because it's pleasurable, right? So then that comes down to the measure of pleasure in our lives. And then that brings us back to the question of the kind of pleasure being frozen will afford you.
Well,
Or
being frozen,
waking up and uploaded into a computer will afford you.
Can I get into this? I mean, because I think one thing we haven't said yet is it's not at all obvious that most people actually do want to live forever. Okay,
right.
So in other words, and I think the big problem here is going to be the extent to which, and Anders touched on this earlier, can we tolerate different lifespans? Right. So let's say we live in a kind of liberal world, and it becomes possible to live forever. If people want to, and certain people decide to do that. But then other people, will live normal lifespans and all of this. And I think, in a sense, it raises very interesting questions about the extent to which we can tolerate alternative views of what counts as a meaningful human life, right? Because I think that's kind of what the issue is on the table ultimately. And
what you just said is terrifying, because who determines what's a meaningful human life?
I know, I agree. I mean, it is going to be very challenging. Let's put it that way, because we're not used to such diversity. We're not used to such a diversity of, let's say, lifespans, for example. And I think that is going to cause some issues, actually.
And what happens if you opt in for one of these indefinite life extension options, and about 200 years in, you decide you want out, right? Are we going to have a way of shutting it down, right?
Yeah.
It's a new field for lawyers.
Yeah. Right.
Getting your life extended, that's not hard. It's much harder to undo being dead.
Right.
And there we have the heart of the inspiration of the human person. It is much harder to undo being dead, but that's what we're really talking about. How do we undo being dead?
Right.
Well, listen, I want to thank you all. This has been absolutely fascinating, and we'll have to have you all back.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
And your Dr. Matt and Sister Mary and Professor Steve, thank you. It's been an honor.
No problem.
Thank you. Nice
Thank
to
you.
meet you all.